4 years, from 1914 to 1918, Europe seemed on course to destroy itself. On August the 4th, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. Most of the world's major powers were soon drawn into the conflict. By the time the war ended, almost 40 nations in Europe, Africa, the Middle East and East Asia were involved. The so-called Great War was fought with unprecedented destructive power. A total of more than 16 million people were killed. Parts of Belgium and northern France were devastated. The Austrian writer Stefan Zweig said the war had affected him deeply.
All the pale horses of the apocalypse have stormed through my life, including revolution, starvation, and epidemics. Above all, nationalism has poisoned our flourishing European culture.
In France alone, 1.4 million soldiers were killed. The Allied powers, including the British Empire, France, the United States, Belgium, Italy and Serbia, had defeated the Central Powers, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. When the armistice was announced in 1918, people in the Allied countries took to the streets to celebrate. The French writer Albert Simonin described the scene in Paris.
In the crowd, young factory workers and fashionably dressed ladies hugged and kissed each other.
Everyone hoped this would be the war to end all wars. A former French soldier, Louis Barthas, described his feelings in a diary.
I was free from the clutches of the military. I learned to hate the military, and I will teach my children to hate it too. I'll teach them that words like fatherland, glory, and honor merely hide how terrible, ugly, and cruel war really is.
The great empires of Europe were falling apart. The war that had killed millions prompted new demands for independence. In April 1916, Irish Republicans in Dublin launched an insurrection against British rule. But the uprising was poorly organised and was put down quickly by British troops. Once again, the Union Jack flew over the Irish capital. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a truly multinational state, had ceased to exist by early November 1918. The empire's larger ethnic minorities, including Czechs, Slovaks, Croats and Slovenes, demanded independence and hoped that America would help them achieve it. US President Woodrow Wilson sought to create a durable peace. As part of this effort, Wilson announced that from now on, the peoples of Europe should be governed only by their own consent. He described self-determination as an imperative principle of action. Empires collapsed. People rose up in revolt. Ex-monarchs fled. The last Austrian emperor, Charles I, stepped down from the Habsburg throne. He and his wife Zita were exiled to Madeira in 1921. In 1922, Turkey's new parliament expelled the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI. Several new states would emerge from the ruins of his empire. But some monarchs were celebrated as heroes. During the war, Belgium's King Albert I had fought alongside his troops. His wife Elisabeth served at the front as a nurse. Germany's occupation of Belgium ended with the armistice that was declared on November the 11th, 1918. Belgians honoured Canadian troops who had played a major role in the last great offensive of the war, known as the 100 Days. In that operation, Canadian units suffered more than 45,000 casualties. In the Flanders region of northern Belgium, Scottish troops seized a German supply train filled with hand grenades. As German forces retreated from northern France, they destroyed everything that lay in their path. After the armistice, life in Europe slowly began to return to normal. The end to the fighting was announced on the morning of November the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The armistice remained in force as negotiations on a final peace treaty got underway. The talks would be difficult, not least because hatred continued to smoulder throughout Europe. The French writer Henri Fauconnier summed up the situation.
I fear that we are hardly more prepared for peace than we were for war. The most critical phase begins right now. Fortunately, we won the war.
How did Germany react to the armistice and the peace talks? The Germans were ordered to evacuate the territory they'd occupied in Belgium and France, including the regions of Alsace and Lorraine. German troops pulled back behind the Rhine River. The right-wing French political movement Action Française organized a big rally on the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Soldiers scattered soil brought from Alsace to celebrate the return of the region to France. In 1871, after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, France had been forced to cede Alsace and part of Lorraine to Germany. In Alsace, troops that had been defeated nearly 5 decades before now demonstrated their loyalty to France. School children kissed the French flag. But not everyone in the region shared that enthusiasm. Catholics in Alsace felt more secure in the German Empire than they had under the Second French Empire, considered by many to be hostile to the Church. In addition, the Alsatians had come to appreciate the efficiency and order that characterized German rule. French President Raymond Poincaré was born in Lorraine. Poincaré believed it would be impossible to achieve a lasting peace with Germany, given the Kaiser's aggressive approach to foreign policy. So he sought alliances with Russia and Britain, and worked to strengthen the French military. German troops returning home after the war found that society had been severely disrupted. Emperor Wilhelm II stepped down as German Emperor and King of Prussia on November the 9th, 1918, as required by the Armistice Agreement. He spent the rest of his life in exile in the Netherlands. Many Germans saw the abdication as a humiliation. In Germany, troops were often welcomed home by large crowds. Many Germans didn't believe they had lost the war on the battlefield, but that they'd been stabbed in the back by politicians. Later, Adolf Hitler would use that claim to advance his own political agenda. On November the 9th, 1918, a German republic was declared by Philipp Scheidemann, a member of the new cabinet.
Arbeiter und Soldaten, das Alte und Morsche, die Monarchie ist zusammengebrochen. Es lebe das Volk, es lebe die Volksrepublik.
The Marxist agitator Rosa Luxemburg wrote,
"Bourgeois society mimics order, peace and the rule of law, but it is wading in its own blood, filthy and dishonored. The Russian Revolution was the honorable salvation of international socialism."
Russia, November 1917. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, seized power. The country descended into a bloody civil war between communist and anti-communist forces. British, French and US troops were sent to various parts of the country to fight the Bolsheviks. Captured Allied soldiers were shown in propaganda films. Lenin denounced the foreign intervention. The Russian Revolution divided Europe and later the entire world. Communist activists established a Soviet republic in Hungary from March to August 1919. During that time, a group of communist paramilitaries known as the Lenin Boys executed several hundred people suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. In August 1919, French and Romanian troops occupied Budapest and put an end to the uprising. Revolution was spreading throughout Europe. Now it was Germany's turn. In January 1919, an armed revolt led by the German Communist Party shook Berlin. A week later, the rebellion was put down by paramilitary troops known as the Freikorps. They arrested and executed the Communist Party leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Some Germans may have continued to idealize the early days of the war, but now the majority of them simply wanted the country to return to peace and prosperity. None could have imagined that 25 years later, Germany would be involved in yet another major conflict. Nor could these people have foreseen that the same regime that started that conflict would also organize the murder of 6 million Jews. On December the 1st, 1918, Belgian, British and French troops occupied Germany's Rhineland region, in accordance with the Armistice Agreement. The River Rhine forms a natural boundary between France and Germany, and also symbolizes the two countries' complex history. At first, many Germans welcomed the arrival of French troops, but their optimism soon turned to resentment and hostility. Among these German children is the future film director Max Ophüls. In his memoirs, Ophüls said he was saddened by the way that French troops had harassed and abused the local residents. A number of soldiers from French African colonies fathered children with local women. Starting in 1937, the Nazis forcibly sterilized several hundred of these mixed-race offspring. Occupation troops from the British Empire, including those from Canada, were not especially popular with the Rhineland residents. The war had strengthened the Canadians' sense of national pride and their loyalty to the British Crown. The United States provided an estimated 240,000 troops, nearly one-third of the total occupation force. Most of them seemed to get along well enough with the local residents.
We fought against the Krauts, but they didn't invade America or lay siege to New York. We had no need to retaliate. We just wanted peace, and many of us have German roots.
In December 1918, Woodrow Wilson became the first sitting US president to visit Europe. His delegation included Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Assistant Navy Secretary and future president. Wilson attended a series of preliminary negotiations ahead of the Paris peace talks. Wilson and his wife Edith arrived in the French capital on December the 14th. The city gave them a tumultuous welcome.
We will build a prosperous world in which all nations will enjoy the freedom for which France, America, England, and Italy have paid such a high price.
Marcel Cachin, editor of the socialist newspaper L'Humanité, wrote at the time,
Wilson is committed to the working classes. He is the only politician who has discovered the language of goodwill and justice.
Wilson, a Democrat, was first elected president in 1912 and re-elected in 1916. During his election campaign, he promised to keep America out of the European conflict. But after German submarines sank several American ships in early 1917, the US declared war. In January 1918, Wilson presented a 14-point plan for post-war peace. In part, it proposed self-determination for ethnic minorities and the creation of a League of Nations to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of all states. In Paris, Wilson met frequently with the French Prime Minister. Georges Clemenceau had been appointed Prime Minister and Minister of War in November 1917 and called for a complete victory over Germany and the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France. Clemenceau also demanded that Germany pay huge reparations for the damage it had caused during the war. But the British and US delegations were concerned that reparations would ruin the defeated powers financially and could lead to domestic tensions and even civil war. as in Russia. President Wilson spent the last 5 days of 1918 in Britain, and on January the 1st travelled to Italy for talks with King Victor Emmanuel and the Prime Minister. Wilson also began preparing for the International Peace Conference, due to open on January the 19th. He continued to push for the approval of his 14-point programme, including the right of self-determination for minority peoples. Wilson was warmly received by the Italians, but that had more to do with America's participation in the war than it did with his peace plan. Italian nationalists feared that Wilson's self-determination proposal could lead to territorial losses. One of their more prominent spokesmen was a journalist, Benito Mussolini. The future Italian dictator called Wilson a bandit of international pluralism. The Paris Peace Conference was intended, in part, to conclude peace treaties with the defeated states, set up a schedule of reparations payments to be made by Germany, and draft international borders that accurately reflected ethnic boundaries. A total of 27 states took part in the conference, but the negotiations were dominated by the Big Four Allied powers. President Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando. For the next several months, the participants negotiated the terms of peace treaties with the defeated powers. The German delegation was not allowed to take part in the discussions. They hoped that the final treaty would be based on Wilson's 14 points and would not involve any loss of territory. The Germans were deeply concerned that Clemenceau would take a hard line and weaken the new German Republic so as to eliminate its ability to threaten France. At the end of 6 months of discussions, the various delegations arrived at the Palace of Versailles to sign the main peace treaty. The ceremony took place on June the 28th, 1919. The date was no coincidence. Exactly 5 years before, on June the 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had been assassinated in Sarajevo. His murder had plunged Europe into war. The choice of Versailles was also symbolic. It was here that the new German Empire was proclaimed in 1871, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Clemenceau had 4 severely wounded French soldiers posted at the entrance to the main hall, so that the German delegation would see them when they arrived. The Germans took their places at 3 in the afternoon. They had mere minutes to read and sign the treaty. The conditions opposed by the Allies were harsh. Germany's army was cut to 100,000 men. Tanks, submarines and military aircraft were banned. The size of the navy was sharply reduced. Germany was also ordered to hand over its former colonies and to pay reparations. The final amount was later set at 269 billion gold marks. On July the 14th, France's national holiday, people took to the streets to celebrate their country's victory in the war and the tough conditions imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. But it was also a sad day for those who had lost family members in the conflict. Many veterans were still having a hard time coping with the effects of the fighting. One soldier wrote that the Paris festivities were inappropriate.
You don't celebrate when millions have fallen.
On the same day, Clemenceau organized a huge parade on the Champs-Élysées. Troops from all the Allied armies took part. American journalist Elbert Baldwin was on hand to record the event.
The ample sidewalks are densely crowded. People have climbed onto step ladders, balconies, and roofs. A cannon booms, its echo taken up by the cheering thousands. Here comes Joffre, the victor of the Marne, and Foch, commander-in-chief of the Allied forces. The commander of the American troops, Pershing, looks stern and martial. A bystander shouts, "Smile." The Belgian soldiers do smile. They seem more relaxed. British troops receive a warm welcome. People cheer when they see the Japanese, the Greeks, the Poles, the Portuguese, and the Serbs. But where are the Russians? Not the Bolsheviks, but the ally that sacrificed 2 million men to make this day possible. And Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, on his white horse. He seems younger in person than in his portraits.
French journalist Robert de Flers wrote this account for the daily paper Le Figaro.
All of the uniforms have the same color, that of blood. Mutilated soldiers who've lost arms and legs limp along behind the glorious survivors.
It was all well and good to celebrate a military victory. But what was to become of the 11 million Allied soldiers who were wounded in the war? Those who had lost arms or legs, those who were subjected to poison gas attacks, or who were blinded. What about those whose faces were shattered by shrapnel? Henriette Rémy was a Swiss Red Cross nurse.
I'd never seen anything so horrible. They were about 20 men. They no longer seemed human. Frightening expressions were etched on their faces.
Marcel Capy worked for 4 years in an ammunition factory, replacing men who'd been called up to the front.
The war has left us nothing but cemeteries and ruins.
By this time, women in France were demanding the right to vote, a privilege that British women had won the year before. And now they were losing their jobs to returning veterans. After the war, Capy became a pacifist.
The so-called peace treaties are potential sources of conflict. They are punitive and guided by the principle of injustice, and they have plunged Europe into chaos. The Treaty of Versailles is absurd.
That treaty and its alleged injustices were used by Adolf Hitler to promote his nationalist agenda. This footage shows Hitler at a right-wing demonstration in 1919. At that time, he was working as an informer for the German military. Many Germans considered the Versailles Treaty unfair, and Hitler's speeches played to their worst fears.
Versailles was a disgrace. This dictated peace is plundering our people. It's outrageous. France, our mortal enemy, has its hands on our throats.
Hitler drove home the point that many Germans were now living in poverty.
Let the shame and hatred of 60 million Germans turn into a sea of flames.
The treaty required German soldiers to hand over their weapons. In return, they received financial compensation. The Allies supervised the destruction of the German aircraft and tanks. Many senior German officers felt humiliated by all this. The military began training what was left of its army into an elite force that would one day, perhaps, be able to take its revenge on France and Britain. The new Weimar government was constantly under threat by right-wingers and militarists. Austrian-born Adolf Hitler soon emerged as one of their most prominent spokesmen. As early as 1919, German Freikorps started painting swastikas on their helmets. Officer Ernst Jünger wrote,
"This war is not the end of violence. It is the beginning."
War veteran Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz.
When we heard that the war was over, we just laughed. We were the war. The flame of war continued to burn in us.
A lot of Germans still backed the military. Later, many of these same people would support Hitler. Some industrialists made fortunes during the war by selling weapons and military gear. They came to be known derisively as Rafkes, or money grubbers. The war profiteers lived in luxury, while many average Germans had been reduced to poverty. In France, the trenches were now empty. Birds sang again. But the Allies were struggling to demobilize millions of troops. Military mail was still censored, until individual soldiers returned to civilian life. One of them expressed his frustration at the delays.
Why don't they let us go? The war is over. Why can't we go back to our families?
The French singer Mistinguett dedicated a chanson to the women who'd been reunited with their husbands.
Sur cette terre, ma seule joie, mon seul bonheur, c'est mon homme. J'ai donné tout ce que j'ai, mon amour et tout mon cœur à mon homme. Et même la nuit, quand je rêve, c'est de lui, de mon homme. Ce n'est pas qu'il est beau, qu'il est riche ni costaud, mais je l'aime, c'est idiot.
In France, 5 million demobilized soldiers needed civilian clothes, but there was a shortage of material. At first, some men simply tried to dye old uniforms. That idea was quickly abandoned, and the government gave each man a clothing allowance. Many of the veterans were farmers, and they returned to their fields. But in the factories, jobs were few and far between. France also cut back on new weapons, and women who had worked in war production facilities were sacked to make room for returning veterans. The demobilization process was a serious problem for troops from Australia and New Zealand. Many were stranded in filthy transit camps. They didn't have much to do except sit around and kill time until they could leave. Some of them entertained each other with skits, like this one, about death. Meanwhile, a deadly influenza outbreak known as the Spanish flu was spreading around the world, and soldiers were among those hit hardest. Between 1918 and 1920, the disease killed at least 50 million people. As the soldiers returned home, they had to readjust to civilian life, as Earl Sutherland from Toronto in Canada explained in a letter to his mother.
I'm going to marry a girl whose father was German. Please don't criticize me for that. Rosa is a lovely girl who has been very good to me. Please don't judge her before you meet her.
Lieutenant Arthur Lapointe of Canada's 22nd Infantry Regiment was pleased to be heading back home to Quebec.
My heart is overflowing with joy. I thought I would never see this country again.
Several members of Lapointe's family died of flu, and his neighbour's husband had been killed at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917. Many veterans found it hard to make the transition.
They've been subjected to military drills and obeying orders for so long that many have lost their sense of self.
Canadian military hospitals set up physical therapy programs to help wounded veterans.
The word impossible does not exist here. Their future success will depend on the energy and diligence that they put into their recovery.
More than 470,000 American troops were now on their way home. But before they left Europe, they were thoroughly disinfected to eliminate any diseases they may have picked up in the trenches or in brothels. Medical officials also tried to combat the spread of Spanish flu. Many Afro-American soldiers had mixed feelings about returning to the US. In Europe, they hadn't experienced the racism that was widespread in America, particularly in the Deep South. And at this time, the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan was at the height of its power. Life on the southern plantations had changed little since slavery was abolished in 1865. This spiritual was popular at the time. But in some parts of the northern US, the return of Afro-American veterans was celebrated. One soldier, James Reese Europe, remembers it this way.
Cheers came from the windows, the roofs, the streets. Numerous people joined the parade.
A total of about 350,000 black troops served on the Western Front. One of the most famous Afro-American units was the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Civil rights activist Marcus Garvey demanded racial equality.
We believe that blacks should have the same rights and privileges as other people.
But President Wilson favored a policy of racial segregation, at the same time that he was promoting the right of European peoples to self-determination. Wilson campaigned across America on behalf of the Peace Treaty and the League of Nations. The treaty would have to be ratified by the US Senate, but Wilson could not put together the necessary two-thirds vote. The majority party, the Republicans, were opposed to it, mainly because the League of Nations would limit the Senate's power to declare war. Public opinion on the treaty was mixed, with most of the opposition coming from Republicans, ethnic Germans, and Irish Catholic Democrats. Wilson tried to win them over.
If we reject the League of Nations, we will break the world's heart.
On October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke and was no longer able to carry out his duties as president. Would the Senate ratify the Versailles Treaty? And if not, would the League of Nations be able to function effectively without the United States?